She walked into my shop wearing Hermes and carrying forged documents. My daughter thought the dusty trinkets collecting cobwebs were my life's work, heirlooms worth auctioning to fund her divorce. She had no idea I'd replaced every original with museum-grade fakes 15 years ago. While she planned the sale, I planned her education in provenance verification. I was sitting on the wooden stool behind the counter when the white Range Rover pulled up outside Vance Antiques and Curiosities. The vehicle still had dealer plates on it, that temporary cardboard rectangle people display when they need strangers to know they just spent money. Through the shop window, dust motes drifting in the afternoon light, I watched Victoria step out onto the cracked Boylston Street sidewalk. She wore a camel-colored coat that probably cost more than I paid myself in half a year. Two men emerged behind her. One carried a leather portfolio with gold embossing I could read even from 30 feet away. Sotheby's. The other had a camera with a network affiliate logo stuck to the side. I set down the jeweler's loupe I'd been using to examine a reproduction Tiffany lamp. My hands didn't shake. My pulse didn't quicken. I felt the familiar sensation I used to get walking into a warehouse full of stolen Rembrandts back when I worked for the Federal Bureau of Investigation's art crime team. That cold clarity. That sense of watching a system failure occur in real time, knowing you're the only technician in the room who understands what's breaking. Victoria entered without knocking. Her heels made sharp percussive sounds on the old floorboards, each step a tiny detonation. The boards were original to the building, installed in 1873, and they announced every visitor with groans and creaks that told me weight distribution and gait pattern. She was moving fast. Confident. The cameraman positioned himself near the door where he'd have a clean angle on both of us. The men with the portfolio, mid-40s, wearing a suit that fit too perfectly to be American-made, surveyed my shelves with the expression of someone appraising a carcass. I stayed on my stool. My hands rested on the oak counter that had been my workspace for 3 decades. The wood was smooth where my forearms had worn it down, darker in those spots from 30 years of skin oil and pressure. I could feel the slight depression my left elbow had carved into the grain. Victoria stopped 3 feet from the counter. She smiled. It was the smile she used in photographs, the one that showed her teeth but didn't reach the muscles around her eyes. The kind of smile that requires effort to maintain, and I watched that effort in the tiny tension at her jaw. Behind her, the cameraman raised his equipment. A small red light appeared. Recording. "Dad," she said, her voice carrying the bright false warmth people use when performing concern for an audience. "We need to talk about your future." I said nothing. I learned a long time ago that silence is the most powerful authentication tool in any investigation. People will fill silence with truth if you let them wait long enough. Their discomfort becomes confession. She placed a manila folder on my counter. It landed with a slap that sent a small puff of dust into the shaft of window light. "I've been consulting with eldercare specialists," she continued, opening the folder to reveal medical letterhead I'd never seen before. "They're concerned about your cognitive decline. Dr. Morrison has documented episodes of confusion, disorientation, difficulty managing basic finances." I looked at the letterhead. Commonwealth Medical Partners. Dr. Richard Morrison, Geriatric Psychiatry. The paper was cream-colored, heavy stock, with a watermark I could see when I held it up to the light. Professional. Official. Completely fabricated. Dr. Morrison retired to Phoenix in 2023, I said. My voice came out quiet, measured, with the slight tremor of an old man who's been caught off guard. "His replacement, Dr. Chen," Victoria said without missing a beat. "You probably don't remember the appointments. That's part of the problem, Dad. The memory gaps." She slid another document toward me, this one with my signature at the bottom. "This is why I had to take action. The power of attorney you signed last Christmas. I'm activating it." I stared. At the signature. It was mine. I remembered signing it, remembered her presenting it during Christmas dinner between the ham and the sweet potatoes, calling it routine estate planning, just a formality in case anything ever happened. I'd been tired that night. Careless. Stupid. The document was real. Whatever came next would be built on that one moment of weakness. "I've arranged an auction," Victoria said, gesturing to the men in the expensive suit. Marcus Henderson from Sotheby's will be handling the liquidation of your inventory. The Ming vases, the Fabergé collection, the Renaissance silverware. Everything. She paused, letting the camera capture her expression of reluctant duty. The proceeds will go into a managed trust for your long-term care. Marcus stepped forward. He had the smooth hands of someone who'd never done physical labor, and when he spoke his voice had the cultivated mid-Atlantic accent wealthy people acquire at expensive universities. Mr. Vance, our preliminary assessment suggests your inventory could bring $4 to $6 million at auction. We're scheduling for mid-May, live bidding, international buyer access. The number hung in the air. $6 million. I felt something tighten in my chest, not panic but something colder. The sensation you get when you're watching a mechanism engage, when you see the gears begin to turn and you know exactly what's going to break and when. $6 million, I repeated, letting my voice carry confusion, maybe a little awe. That's. I trailed off, playing the part of an old man overwhelmed by numbers he can't quite process. Victoria touched my shoulder. The contact was brief, calculated, perfectly positioned for the camera to capture. The devoted daughter comforting her declining father. Her hand was cold through my flannel shirt. You'll be taken care of, she said. There's a beautiful facility near Boca Raton. Memory care unit, 24-hour nursing staff, activities designed for cognitive stimulation. You're going down next month to get settled. While you're adjusting to the new environment, we'll handle the sale. You won't have to worry about any of it. And your divorce settlement? I asked. The words came out before I could stop them, a small crack in the confused old man performance. Her hand tightened on my shoulder. Just for a second. Just long enough for me to feel her fingernails press through the fabric. Then she released, stepped back, smiled again. This isn't about me, Dad. This is about making sure you're safe. But it was about her. I'd heard from a cousin in Newton that Victoria's husband filed papers in January. Massachusetts was an equitable distribution state. She'd need liquid assets to walk away with anything, and her gallery in the South End had been hemorrhaging money since the pandemic. Contemporary art was a tough market when nobody had expendable income. She needed this auction. She needed me docile and confused and on a plane to Florida. She needed me to be exactly what she was telling the world I was. A diminished old man who couldn't be trusted with his own assets. I understand, I said, letting my shoulders sag. I let my hands tremble slightly on the counter. You're trying to help me. I watched relief wash across her face. Her smile became genuine for a moment, the first real expression I'd seen since she walked in. Exactly. Oh Dad, I knew you'd understand once we explained it properly. She looked at Marcus. He's competent to consent. We can proceed. Marcus nodded, making a note on his tablet. We'll need 10 days for comprehensive cataloging and authentication. Professional photography for the auction catalog. I'll have my team here Monday morning to begin the inventory process. They left in a procession of expensive fabric and barely concealed eagerness. Through the window I watched Victoria check her phone before she even reached the Range Rover. Probably texting her lawyer. Probably calculating percentages. The vehicle pulled away from the curb, and I listened to the sound of its engine fade into the ambient noise of Boston traffic. I sat on my stool in the empty shop. The dust motes continued their slow drift through the window light. The Tiffany lamp reproduction sat on the counter where I'd left it, its glass panels glowing amber and green. I'd purchased it from a forger in Prague in 2008 for $400. He was a master craftsman, a man who could replicate Tiffany's copper foil technique so precisely that even museum curators had been fooled. The lamp next to it, a small Fabergé egg on a brass stand, came from a workshop in St. Petersburg. $3,200, commissioned specifically to mimic the Imperial Collection style. The Ming vases on the shelf behind me, the ones Marcus had identified in his preliminary assessment, were perfect reproductions from a family workshop in Jingdezhen. $800 each. Every single piece in my shop was fake. Museum grade, expert level, could fool a curator fake. The real collection, $42 million in authenticated pieces accumulated by my father and grandfather and myself over 70 years, sat in a climate-controlled vault in Geneva. Catalogued, insured, protected by a trust that bore only my name. I'd moved everything in 2009. I'd spent the next 6 years carefully acquiring reproductions, building provenance documents, creating a decoy inventory designed to test exactly this scenario. Because I'd known it was coming. I'd watched Victoria circle for years, ever since her mother died in 2011. She'd asked careful questions about inheritance, suggested I downsize, introduced me to financial advisors who wanted to optimize my assets. I'd watched her calculate. I'd watched her evaluate my possessions the way a butcher evaluates livestock, assessing which cuts would bring the highest price. So I'd prepared. I'd built a trap using the one thing she couldn't resist. The illusion of easy money. I stood up from my stool. My knees ached, a sharp grinding sensation that came from 70 years of use and not enough maintenance. I walked to the door and turned the sign from open to closed. Then I pulled down the shade, cutting off the window light, letting the shop fall into amber gloom. I had 10 days before Marcus's team arrived to begin cataloging. 10 days before Victoria spent money on marketing, venue deposits, catalog printing. 10 days to let her commit so deeply that when the trap closed, she'd have no way out. I pulled my phone from my pocket. The screen was cracked in the corner from when I dropped it last month. I dialed a number I hadn't called in 5 years. It rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. Sterling Vance. I thought you were dead. James Whitmore. My former supervisor at the art crime team. Retired now, running a private authentication consultancy in Washington. I need you in Boston on May 15th, I said. What's the job? My daughter is about to auction $15 million in forgeries. I need you to authenticate them. Publicly. In front of international buyers and television cameras. There was a pause. Then a low whistle that crackled through the phone speaker. You're serious? I'm sending you the documentation tonight. Every piece, every reproduction, every receipt. Can you be here? I wouldn't miss this for anything, James said. I could hear the smile in his voice. This is going to be legendary. I ended the call. I stood in my dark shop surrounded by beautiful lies, feeling the weight of what I'd set in motion. The trap was baited. The mechanism was armed. All I had to do now was wait for Victoria to spring it herself. I thought about that power of attorney, about my signature on the bottom of the page. About one moment of carelessness during Christmas dinner. She thought that signature gave her power. She didn't understand that in authentication work, provenance is everything. A signature is only valuable if you know what you're signing. And Victoria had no idea what she'd just put her name on. I closed the shop at 5 in the evening and walked 6 blocks east to the storage facility on Boylston. The air had that early spring bite to it, the kind that gets into your joints and reminds you that 70 years of wear doesn't come with a warranty. My knee made a clicking sound with every 4th step, a rhythm I'd grown used to. The sidewalk was uneven, buckled from decades of freeze-thaw cycles, and I watched my feet to avoid the cracks that could turn an old man's walk into a fall. Secure Space Storage sat between a dry cleaner and a Vietnamese restaurant, the kind of anonymous brick building that nobody looks at twice. I'd rented Unit 247 in 2009, paid through an LLC Victoria didn't know existed. $140 a month, automatically drafted from an account I'd set up specifically for things I wanted to keep invisible. The overhead door rattled when I pulled it up, metal scraping against metal, and the smell of concrete dust and old cardboard rolled out. I stepped inside and pulled the chain for the single bulb. Yellow light flooded the 10 by 10 space. Cardboard banker's boxes lined the walls, stacked 3 high, each one labeled with dates and case numbers from my FBI years. I'd kept everything. Every authentication report, every provenance analysis, every piece of evidence from 30 years of hunting forgers and thieves who thought they could fool the system. In the back corner, under a gray tarp that had gone stiff with age, were the files I needed. I pulled the tarp off and dragged the boxes into the center of the unit. My back complained, a hot wire of pain that ran from my lumbar spine up to my shoulder blades. I ignored it. Pain was just information. It told you the machine was still running. I opened the first box. Manila folders, organized chronologically. I spread them across the concrete floor, creating a timeline of my decoy operation. 2008, receipts from Prague. Correspondence with Mikhail Volkov, master glasswork forger, discussing the Tiffany lamp specifications. I'd paid in cash, $400 converted to Czech koruna, and Mikhail had delivered a piece so perfect that I'd tested it myself using the same spectroscopy equipment the FBI used for authentication. Modern glass, modern lead, modern copper foil. Beautiful and completely fraudulent. 2009, invoices from St. Petersburg. Dmitry Kuzmin, eggmaker, trained in the traditional Fabergé workshop techniques. He'd created 3 eggs for me over 18 months. The correspondence was in Russian, which I'd learned during my federal years when we were tracking Soviet-era art theft networks. Dmitry had died in 2012, taking his skills with him, but the eggs remained. Flawless reproductions worth maybe $3,000 total but appearing to be worth $3 million. 2010 through 2015, a rotating catalog of artisans, forgers, and craftsmen I'd worked with during investigations. People who'd taken plea deals, served their time, and returned to their trade in legitimate capacities. I'd hired them to create my decoy inventory, piece by piece, building a collection that would fool everyone except an expert with proper equipment. And I documented everything. Every transaction, every material analysis, every chemical signature that proved modern origin. The evidence was irrefutable. In the second box were the Geneva documents. Vault Manifest from Geneva Storage Solutions AG, dated March 2009. Every piece of the real Vance collection, catalogued and secured. Insurance appraisals from Lloyd's of London showing $42 million in authenticated art, antiquities, and historical objects. Transfer documents showing that I'd moved everything before the financial crisis hit, before my wife got sick, before Victoria started asking questions about inheritance. The trust documents were in the third box. Irrevocable trust established in 2009 under Swiss law. Naming me as the sole beneficiary during my lifetime, with specific distribution instructions upon my death. Victoria wasn't mentioned. I'd removed her after I watched her push her mother to sign a new will during the final hospice weeks, watching her circle the deathbed like a creditor waiting for payment. That was when I knew. That was when I understood that whatever I'd raised, whatever I'd hoped she'd become, the person standing in that hospice room was someone who viewed family as assets to be liquidated. I'd given her chances. After her mother died, I'd offered to help with the gallery. She'd refused, said she didn't want my outdated advice. When her marriage started failing, I'd suggested counseling. She'd laughed, said therapy was for people who couldn't solve their own problems. When she'd started asking about the shop inventory, hinting that I should retire and let the professionals handle the valuable pieces, I'd smiled and played the sentimental old man who couldn't bear to part with his treasures. I'd played that role for 15 years. Every time she visited, every Christmas dinner, every phone call where she'd suggest I was getting too old to manage things properly, I'd reinforced her assumption that I was exactly what she needed me to be. Weak. Confused. Sitting on a fortune I was too sentimental and stupid to properly manage. But I wasn't weak. I was patient. There's a difference, though most people never learn it. Weakness is the inability to act. Patience is the choice to wait until action produces maximum effect. I photographed every document with my phone, the camera making soft clicking sounds in the concrete silence. Each image was automatically uploaded to a secure server I'd set up through a data management company in Iceland. Redundant backups, encrypted storage, accessible from anywhere with an internet connection. By the time I finished, I had 317 photographs documenting the complete architecture of Victoria's impending catastrophe. I called James Whitmore. The phone rang 4 times before he picked up, and I could hear classical music playing in the background. Vivaldi, I thought. Something with violins. I'm sending you the files now, I said. How much material are we talking about? James asked. 47 pieces. Furniture, art, jewelry, antiquities. Each one documented from commission through delivery. Full material analysis showing modern origin. Plus the Geneva records proving the real collection never left Switzerland. Chain of custody. Unbroken. Every receipt, every correspondence, every artisan's signature. I built this case the way we used to build them for federal prosecution. Jesus, Sterling. You've been planning this for 15 years. I looked around the storage unit, at the boxes of evidence I'd accumulated while Victoria thought I was just a sentimental old man playing with dusty trinkets. 16 years, I said. Since 2009. Since I realized what she was. There was a pause. I heard James take a drink of something, ice cubes clinking against glass. What changed? He asked. Why spring the trap now? She brought cameras, I said. She documented her own fraud. She created third-party witnesses who'll testify she knew I was competent when she activated the power of attorney. She handed me the evidence of her intent. And the medical documentation. The cognitive decline narrative. Fabricated using a retired doctor's identity. I've already verified that Dr. Morrison hasn't practiced in Massachusetts since 2023. The current doctor they're claiming diagnosed me, Dr. Chen, has no record of me as a patient. I checked this morning. Victoria's attorney created those documents, which means he's committed medical fraud and identity theft. He'll be disbarred before she ever sees a courtroom. James whistled again, that low sound of professional appreciation. You've got her locked down. Completely, I said. The moment she presents those fake pieces to buyers under authentication, she commits wire fraud. International wire fraud, because she's advertising to foreign buyers. Federal charges, 5 to 20 years minimum. When do you want me there? Auction is scheduled for May 15th. Sotheby's is handling it at the Fairmont Copley Plaza. I need you in position before the first lot goes up. Can you bring the portable spectroscopy kit? I can bring the full forensic suite, James said. X-ray fluorescence, infrared spectroscopy, ultraviolet analysis. We'll authenticate them in real time, in front of everyone. It'll be like the Hoffman case in 2007, except this time we're not raiding a warehouse. We're crashing an auction. The Hoffman case. I remembered it. International art fraud ring, fake Picassos being sold through legitimate auction houses. We'd walked into Christie's in New York with federal warrants and authentication equipment, pulled 6 paintings mid-auction, and arrested 4 people on the floor. The art world had talked about it for years. This would be bigger. This would be a daughter selling her father's legacy, broadcast on camera, authenticated as garbage in front of the international collecting community. I'll handle the logistics, I said. You just be ready with the equipment. Sterling, James said, and his voice carried something I hadn't heard before. Concern, maybe. Or caution. Are you sure about this? Once we do it, there's no walking it back. She's your daughter. She stopped being my daughter when she forged medical documents to declare me incompetent, I said. The words came out flat, factual, empty of emotion. Now she's just another forger. And I've spent 30 years catching forgers. I ended the call. I sat on the concrete floor of the storage unit, surrounded by evidence of my daughter's greed and my own patient vengeance. My back ached from sitting on the hard surface. The single bulb overhead flickered occasionally, a loose connection somewhere in the wiring that the storage company had never bothered to fix. I thought about Victoria as a child. 6 years old, sitting at my workbench in the old house in Newton, watching me examine a supposedly Renaissance-era cameo through a microscope. She'd asked how I could tell it was fake. I'd shown her the tool marks, the modern cutting techniques that didn't exist in the 1500s, the chemical composition of the stone that was wrong for the period. She'd been fascinated. She'd asked smart questions. I'd thought maybe she'd follow me into the work, learn the craft of authentication, develop the patience and precision it required. But somewhere between that 6-year-old girl and the 48-year-old woman who'd walked into my shop with cameras and forged medical records, something had broken. Or maybe it had never been there at all. Maybe I'd just wanted to see potential that didn't exist. Maybe I'd been authenticating a forgery all along, mistaking performance for genuine substance. It didn't matter now. She'd made her choice. She'd decided I was an asset to be liquidated, a problem to be managed, an obstacle between her and the money she needed. She'd weaponized my age, my solitude, my quiet life in a dusty shop. She'd looked at everything I'd built and seen only its auction value. So I'd let her look. I'd let her calculate. I'd let her plan and scheme and forge documents and hire auction houses. And when she'd committed fully, When she'd spent money and reputation and gathered witnesses and cameras to document her victory, I'd show her what she'd actually bought. Not 6 million in art and antiquities. Not her father's incompetence and decline. Just a collection of expensive forgeries and a federal case with her name on it. I stood up. My knees cracked. I gathered the files back into their boxes, carefully, methodically, the way you handle evidence you know will end up in a courtroom. I pulled the tarp back over them and turned off the light. The storage unit went dark except for the ambient glow from the hallway. I pulled the door down and locked it. The walk back to my apartment took 15 minutes. The temperature had dropped with sunset, and I could see my breath in the streetlight glow. My apartment was above the shop, a one-bedroom with slanted ceilings and original plaster walls that cracked more every winter. I climbed the narrow stairs, feeling each step in my lower back. Inside, I made coffee in the old percolator I'd inherited from my father. It made a burbling sound that filled the kitchen, familiar and rhythmic. I sat at the small table by the window and watched the street below. A few cars passed. A couple walked by holding hands, laughing about something I couldn't hear. The coffee tasted bitter and hot, and I held the mug with both hands, feeling the heat seep into my palms. 10 days until Marcus and his team arrived. 10 days until Victoria's plan became irreversible. 10 days to prepare for the moment when patience transformed into action, and the trap I'd spent 16 years building finally closed. Victoria returned on April 3rd with a moving crew and Marcus's authentication team. I was sitting in my recliner when they arrived, the one with the spring poking through the seat cushion that I kept meaning to fix but never did. I wore the same cardigan I'd worn for 6 days straight, gray wool with buttons missing, stained with coffee at the collar. I hadn't shaved in 4 days. The stubble on my face was white and patchy, and I'd stopped combing my hair so it stuck up in the back where I'd slept on it. I looked exactly like a man in cognitive decline, exactly like the narrative Victoria had constructed. The door opened without a knock. Victoria entered first, followed by Marcus and 3 assistants carrying equipment cases. Cameras, lights, measurement tools. They moved through my shop like an occupying force, claiming territory, establishing dominance. I stayed in my chair, blinking slowly, trying to look confused by the sudden activity. "Dad," Victoria said, her voice pitched loud and slow, the way people talk to children or the very old. "The team needs to start the cataloging process. Why don't you go rest upstairs? This is going to take a few days." I pushed myself up from the chair, letting my hands shake on the armrests, making the movement labored and uncertain. I shuffled toward the stairs that led to my apartment, my slippers scuffing on the floor. Behind me I heard Marcus giving instructions. Photograph everything from multiple angles. Document condition, measurements, any maker's marks. We need the provenance files for each piece. Mr. Vance, where do you keep your acquisition records? I stopped on the 3rd stair, gripping the railing. Filing cabinet, I said, my voice weak and uncertain. Behind the counter. Green metal 1. I heard a drawer slide open. Perfect. The provenance files I'd created were masterpieces of forgery themselves. Fake auction records from Christie's and Sotheby's catalogs going back to the 1980s. Fabricated letters from museum curators expressing interest in various pieces. Each document carefully aged with tea staining and deliberate handling where they'd pass visual inspection. They'd pass cursory authentication. They'd fool everyone except someone who actually contacted the institutions to verify, and nobody would do that until after the auction. By then it would be too late. I continued up the stairs, moving slowly, counting each step in my head. 13 steps total. My apartment door was at the top, slightly warped in the frame so it always stuck when you tried to close it. I went inside and left the door open a crack. From there I could hear everything happening in the shop below. For 3 days they worked. I stayed mostly in my apartment, occasionally shuffling down to use the bathroom or make coffee. Each time I appeared, I reinforced the performance. I asked Victoria who these people were. I asked what they were doing with my things. I called Marcus by the wrong name twice. "Martin," I said, squinting at him. "Why are you taking pictures of my lamp?" "It's Marcus, Mr. Vance," he corrected gently. "We're just documenting your collection for the sale. Remember?" Your daughter explained this. Sale, I repeated, letting confusion cloud my expression. Are we selling the shop? Victoria touched my arm, guiding me back toward the stairs. Just some pieces, Dad. To help pay for your care in Florida. You're going to love it there. Palm trees and sunshine. I let her lead me away, compliant and docile. But I was listening. I was watching. I was recording everything. The small digital recorder I'd placed inside the heating vent near the counter captured every conversation. The camera I'd installed in the smoke detector 6 months ago, when I first sensed Victoria's interest intensifying, recorded every movement. I was building a documentary record of her intent, her knowledge, her deliberate fraud. On April 8th, Marcus gathered Victoria in the back office. I heard the door close, but the walls in the old building were thin, plaster over wooden lath, and sound traveled. I positioned myself in the upstairs hallway, directly above the office, where a heat register carried their voices up through the ductwork. Initial assessment is complete, Marcus said. We're looking at 47 major pieces. If authenticity holds, we're estimating auction totals between 8 and 10 million, significantly higher than our preliminary figures. 10 million, Victoria breathed. I could hear the hunger in her voice, the way the number filled her mouth like food. The Fabergé pieces alone could bring 3 million. There's a collector in Dubai who's been looking for imperial-style eggs. The Ming vases have interest from 2 separate Chinese buyers. And the Tiffany lamps, if they're legitimate Tiffany Studios pieces, we have a private museum in Tokyo that's already indicated strong interest. How soon can we move? Victoria asked. Catalog printing takes 2 weeks. We need professional photography, condition reports, full provenance documentation for the premium pieces. I'd recommend a May 15th auction date. That gives us time to market internationally and build bidding momentum. Cost. Full service, international marketing, venue rental at the Fairmont, insurance, catalog production, we're looking at approximately $200,000 in advance costs. Sotheby's standard seller premium is 15% of hammer price. At 10 million, that's 1.5 million to us, 8.5 to you, minus the advance costs. So approximately 8.3 million net, Victoria calculated. Yes, assuming strong bidding. Do it, Victoria said. No hesitation. No consultation. Just immediate commitment. I'll need your signature on the consignment agreement, Marcus said. I heard papers rustling. And we'll need the power of attorney documentation showing your legal authority to sell on your father's behalf. I have everything, Victoria said. More rustling. The scratch of pen on paper. She was signing contracts, committing herself legally and financially to an auction of forged goods she believed were authentic. Every signature was another link in the chain of evidence. They emerged from the office 10 minutes later. Victoria was smiling, that genuine expression of satisfaction I'd seen when she was young and got something she wanted. Marcus shook her hand, professional and congratulatory. We'll begin catalog production immediately, he said. I'll send you proofs for approval by April 20th. After they left, I retrieved the recorder from the heating vent. I sat at my kitchen table and played back the conversation, listening to my daughter commit fraud in her own voice. I saved the file with 3 redundant backups. Then I called my attorney, Richard Hartman, a man I'd worked with during my FBI years when cases required civilian legal expertise. He was 73 now, mostly retired, but he still took cases that interested him. Richard, I said when he answered. I need you to witness something. What am I witnessing? The systematic defrauding of an elderly person by his own daughter. And I need you to prepare documentation for the aftermath. Aftermath, Richard repeated. You mean prosecution? I mean complete legal destruction. I want her buried so deep she'll need archaeological equipment to dig herself out. Tell me what you have. I told him everything. The fake medical records. The power of attorney obtained under false pretenses. The consignment of forged goods worth perhaps $50,000 but being represented as worth $10 million. The $200,000 in advance costs Victoria was authorizing Sotheby's to spend. The international wire fraud implications when foreign buyers transferred money for goods falsely advertised. Richard was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he said, "This is federal." I know. Once we trigger this, there's no stopping it. FBI, U.S. Attorney's Office, possibly. SEC if she's used any of the anticipated proceeds for financial planning. She's looking at 5 to 20 years. I know, I said again. She's your daughter, Sterling. She was my daughter, I corrected. The woman signing those contracts is someone who forged medical documents to declare me incompetent. She's a criminal who happens to share my DNA. There's a difference. All right, Richard said. I'll prepare the filings. Do you want to wait until after the auction to move, or do you want to stop it before she commits in front of witnesses? Let it happen, I said. I want her standing in front of 300 people when the authentication results come through. I want her professional reputation destroyed in real time. I want her to feel exactly what she tried to do to me, except she'll feel it knowing she did it to herself. That's not justice, Sterling. That's vengeance. No, I said, looking out my kitchen window at the street below, at the shop that held my carefully constructed decoy, at the life I'd built specifically to test this moment. Justice is abstract. Vengeance is concrete. Justice is what courts give you after everything is already destroyed. Vengeance is what you create yourself, deliberately, with full knowledge of the consequences. I'm not interested in making her pay. I'm interested in making her understand. There's a difference. Richard sighed. I'll be there May 15th. With the FBI documentation and the authentication records ready to file. On April 25th the auction catalogs arrived. Heavy glossy publications, 50 pages each, printed on thick paper that had weight and substance. The cover showed my shop's interior, photographed in golden afternoon light that made everything look warm and valuable. The Vance Collection, 3 generations of American collecting excellence. My father's name was listed. My grandfather's name. A brief history of our family's passion for art and antiquities, written in the flowery language auction houses used to transform commerce into culture. Inside were photographs of every piece. The Fabergé eggs on black velvet backgrounds. The Ming vases lit to emphasize their glaze patterns. The Tiffany lamps glowing like jewels. Each item had a detailed provenance description, estimated value range, and lot number. Lot 17 was a small Renaissance-era silver chalice I'd commissioned from a metalworker in Florence in 2011. Listed estimated value, $80,000 to $120,000. Actual value, $900 plus shipping. Lot 23 was a jade Buddha I'd purchased from a gift shop in Hong Kong in 2013. Listed estimated value, $200,000 to $300,000. Actual value, $300. Every single lot was the same. Gorgeous photographs of worthless objects, wrapped in provenance documents I'd fabricated, being sold to unsuspecting buyers by my daughter who thought she was liquidating my life's work to fund her divorce settlement. Victoria hosted a preview event on May 1st. She rented a gallery space in the South End, her territory, where she felt powerful and connected. She invited collectors, journalists, art dealers, and wealthy curiosity seekers. 200 people came. I watched from across the street, standing in the doorway of a closed bookstore, wearing a coat I'd bought specifically because Victoria had never seen it. Dark blue, anonymous, the kind businessmen wear. I'd trimmed my beard close and combed my hair. I looked like a different person. Through the gallery windows I watched Victoria work the crowd. She wore a black dress that probably cost $5,000 and moved through the space like a conductor leading an orchestra. I saw her laughing with a man in traditional Emirati dress, probably the Dubai collector Marcus had mentioned. I saw her showing photographs on her tablet to an Asian woman who had to be the Shanghai buyer interested in the Ming vases. She was building relationships. She was leveraging this auction to establish herself as a serious player in the international art market. She was constructing her professional future on a foundation of forgeries and fraud. And she was doing it with absolute confidence, with no doubt or hesitation, because she believed her incompetent old father had left her a fortune to exploit. I pulled out my phone and took photographs of the event. Victoria shaking hands. Victoria pointing at catalog images. Victoria accepting what looked like business cards from well-dressed collectors. More documentation. More evidence. More proof of deliberate intent and knowing fraud. At 9:30 the event ended. The crowd dispersed into the mild May evening. Victoria stood in the gallery doorway saying goodbye to the last guests, and for a moment she was alone, backlit by the interior lights, and I could see her face clearly. She was smiling. Not the performance smile she used for cameras. A real smile, spontaneous and genuine, the expression of someone who believes they've won. I turned and walked back to my shop. I climbed the stairs to my apartment. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table with the auction catalog open in front of me. 14 days until May 15th. 14 days until Victoria stood in the Fairmont Copley Plaza Grand Ballroom and learned the difference between appearance and authenticity. 14 days until the trap I'd spent 16 years building finally closed on the person I'd spent 48 years trying to love. The morning of May 15th arrived with that particular quality of spring light that makes Boston look almost European, clean and golden and full of promise. I woke at 5:30, before dawn, and lay in bed listening to the city wake up around me. Trucks making deliveries. The coffee shop 2 blocks down rolling up its metal gate. Somewhere a car alarm went off and stopped. My body ached in all the familiar places. Lower back, right knee, the knuckles on my left hand that I'd broken in 1997 subduing an art thief in a Baltimore warehouse. Old injuries announcing themselves, reminding me that 70 years of use extracts a price. I got up and made coffee. The percolator burbled and hissed, familiar morning sounds. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the sun come up over the roofline across the street, turning the brick buildings from gray to amber. At 7:15 my phone rang. Victoria. I let it ring 4 times before answering, long enough to seem like an old man fumbling for his device. Dad, she said, her voice bright and energized. The car will be there at 9 to take you to the airport. Your flight to Fort Lauderdale leaves at 11. Do you have your bag packed? Bag, I repeated, putting confusion into my voice. For Florida. Remember? We talked about this. You're going to the facility today, getting settled in your new room. They're expecting you at 3 this afternoon. I don't want to go to Florida, I said, letting my voice crack slightly. It's too hot there. Dad, we've been over this. You need professional care. The memory issues are getting worse. Last week you called me Susan. Susan was her mother's name. I hadn't called Victoria that, but she needed to believe I had. She needed the narrative of my decline to be real. I called you Susan. Yes, Dad. You don't even remember. That's why this is necessary. The car will be there at 9. The driver's name is Miguel. He'll help you with your bag. Just be ready, okay? Okay, I said, defeated and compliant. I'll be ready. I hung up. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, feeling the weight of what was about to happen. She was removing me from the equation. Sending me to Florida while the auction proceeded in Boston. Making sure I couldn't interfere, couldn't object, couldn't be present to contradict the story she was telling about my incompetence. It was smart strategy. It was exactly what I would have done if I were trying to commit fraud without witness interference. At 8:45 I carried a small suitcase down to the street. I'd packed it with clothes I'd bought specifically for this purpose, items Victoria had never seen, creating the appearance of an old man preparing for institutional care. Sweatpants, t-shirts with elastic waistbands, slip-on shoes. The costume of diminishment. Miguel arrived in a black town car at 9 exactly. He was maybe 30, professional and courteous, and he helped me into the back seat with the careful gentleness people use with the elderly and fragile. We drove to Logan Airport through morning traffic. I sat in the back seat and watched the city pass by, neighborhoods I'd known for 50 years, streets I'd walked when I was young and my knees didn't ache and my daughter still loved me, or at least I believed she did. We arrived at Terminal B at 9:40. Miguel helped me to the Delta counter. I checked in, received my boarding pass for flight 1247, and proceeded through security. I shuffled slowly through the scanner, set off the metal detector because of the steel pin in my knee from a skiing accident in 1983, submitted to the pat-down with patient resignation. I made it through. I found my gate. I sat in the hard plastic chairs with my suitcase between my feet and waited until boarding was called. Then I got up and walked toward the jetway entrance. But I didn't board. I turned left instead of right, following the signs to the restrooms. Inside a stall I changed clothes. The Business suit I'd packed at the bottom of my suitcase, dark gray wool, tailored in 2019 when I was still doing occasional consulting work. White shirt, blue tie, leather shoes with rubber soles that didn't make noise on hard floors. I packed the sweatpants and slip-ons into the suitcase. I trimmed my beard close with a small electric trimmer, shaping it into something neat and professional instead of wild and neglected. I combed my hair with water and product until it lay flat. I put on clear-framed reading glasses I'd never worn around Victoria. When I looked in the mirror I saw a different person. Not a declining old man being shipped to institutional care. A professional. Someone with authority and purpose. Someone you wouldn't dismiss or underestimate. I left the bathroom and found the taxi stand. 15 minutes later I was heading back into Boston. The driver was Haitian, and we talked about the traffic and the weather and nothing that mattered. He dropped me at the Fairmont Copley Plaza at 11:30. The auction was scheduled to begin at 1 o'clock. I paid cash and tipped well enough to be remembered but not so much as to be memorable. The Fairmont was the kind of hotel that had been hosting Boston's elite since 1912, all marble and gilt and European pretension. The grand ballroom was on the second floor, accessed through a sweeping staircase that was designed to make you feel important as you ascended. I took the service stairs instead, the narrow concrete ones that staff used to move between floors without being seen by guests. I knew the layout. I'd been to a dozen auctions here during my FBI years, back when we raided estate sales looking for stolen art. The service entrance to the grand ballroom was through the catering staging area, a narrow hallway lined with rolling carts and white tablecloths. I slipped through at 11:45, before the catering staff arrived for the post-auction reception Victoria had planned. The ballroom was magnificent. Chandeliers dripping crystal light. Gold leaf on the ceiling molding. 300 chairs arranged in neat rows facing a raised platform where Marcus stood reviewing notes with his assistant. Along the walls were display cases showing selected lots from the auction. The Fabergé eggs under spotlights. The Ming vases on black velvet pedestals. My beautiful forgeries presented like museum treasures. I took a seat in the back row, far right corner, where the lighting was slightly dimmer and the sight lines to the stage were partially obscured by a support column. I sat down and became invisible. Old men in business suits are functionally invisible at high-end auctions. We're assumed to be retired dealers or amateur collectors, people with some money but not enough to matter. Nobody looks at us twice. At 12:30 the room began to fill. Collectors in expensive casual wear, that studied carelessness that actually requires significant wealth to achieve. Journalists with cameras and recording equipment. Auction staff in Sotheby's branded blazers moving through the crowd with tablets, checking registrations and bidding credentials. At 12:45 Victoria arrived. She wore a navy blue dress, simple and elegant, and she moved through the ballroom like she owned it. I watched her stop to speak with the men in Emirati dress I'd seen at the preview event. I watched her laugh with the Shanghai buyer. I watched her accept congratulations from people who clearly thought she was doing something noble, managing her declining father's estate with grace and professionalism. She looked happy. More than happy. She looked vindicated. Successful. Like someone who'd been doubted and was now proving everyone wrong. At 12:55 Marcus took the stage. The crowd settled into their seats. The lights dimmed slightly and stage lights came up, theatrical and dramatic. "Good afternoon," Marcus said into the microphone, his voice smooth and practiced. "Welcome to the Vance Collection Auction. Today we have the privilege of offering 47 exceptional pieces spanning 4 centuries of artistic and cultural achievement. This collection represents 3 generations of passionate collecting by the Vance family, and we're honored to facilitate its transition to new stewardship." He paused, and the spotlight found Victoria standing at the side of the stage. "I'd like to recognize Victoria Vance, who has worked tirelessly to ensure her father's collection finds appropriate homes while securing his future care. This is estate management at its finest, balancing familial duty with professional responsibility." The audience applauded. Victoria smiled and nodded, gracious and humble. I sat in my back corner seat and felt nothing. No anger. No sadness. Just that cold clarity I used to feel in the field when a case was about to break and you could see all the pieces aligning. "Let's begin," Marcus said. Lot 1. A Qing dynasty vase, circa 1720, exceptional condition, provenance documented to the Smithsonian acquisition attempts in 1963. Opening bid $100,000. A paddle went up immediately. Row 5, an Asian man in a tailored suit. 100,000. Do I hear 120? Another paddle. Back row, phone bidder being represented by a Sotheby's associate. The bidding escalated quickly. 140. 160. 180. At 240,000 a phone bidder won. The gavel came down. The room applauded politely. Victoria's smile widened. I looked at my watch. 1:07. In my pocket my phone buzzed silently. A text from James Whitmore. In position. Equipment ready. Waiting for your signal. I typed back one word. Wait. Lot 2 sold for 90,000. Lot 3 for 150. Lot 4, one of the Fabergé eggs, opened at 200,000 and climbed rapidly. The Dubai collector bid aggressively against 2 phone buyers. At 420,000 he won. The hammer fell. The room buzzed with energy. This was turning into exactly the kind of sale that built reputations. High prices, competitive bidding, international interest. Victoria was standing now, near the stage, accepting congratulations from people around her. She looked triumphant. She looked like someone who'd taken a difficult situation and transformed it into success. She looked like someone who believed she'd won. At 1:35, during Lot 9, I stood up. I walked down the center aisle between the rows of seated bidders. My footsteps were silent on the thick carpet. People glanced at me and then away, another old man probably heading to the bathroom. But I didn't turn toward the exit. I walked to the front row. I stopped directly in Victoria's line of sight. She was talking to Marcus's assistant, discussing something about Lot 12, and then she looked up and saw me. Her expression froze. Recognition hit her in stages. First confusion, because I was supposed to be on a plane. Then shock, because I didn't look like the declining old man she'd sent to Florida. Then fear, quick and bright, before she controlled it and transformed it into anger. "Dad," she said, loud enough that people nearby turned to look. "You're supposed to be on your way to Florida. What are you doing here?" I didn't answer. I pulled out my phone and sent James the signal. One word. Now. Then I looked at Victoria and said, quiet enough that only she could hear, "I came to watch you sell my forgeries." The color drained from her face. "What are you talking about?" "Every piece in this auction is fake," I said, still quiet, still calm. "I commissioned them between 2008 and 2015. The real collection is in Geneva. It's been there for 16 years. "That's insane," Victoria said, but her voice had lost its certainty. "You're confused. The provenance documents, the authentication reports, Marcus verified everything." "I created the provenance documents," I said. "I fabricated every auction record, every museum correspondence, every certificate of authenticity. I spent 30 years hunting forgers for the FBI. I know how to create false provenance better than anyone you've ever met." Marcus had stopped the bidding. The room was watching us now, sensing drama but not yet understanding its nature. Victoria grabbed my arm. Her fingers dug into my bicep hard enough to hurt. "You're embarrassing yourself," she hissed. "You're having an episode. Let me get you somewhere quiet." "I'm not having an episode," I said. "I'm having you arrested." The back doors of the ballroom opened. James Whitmore entered, flanked by 2 FBI agents in windbreakers with the bureau seal on the chest. Behind them came 2 technicians wheeling equipment cases on rolling carts. The room went silent. Every head turned. James walked down the center aisle with the measured pace of someone who'd done this before, someone who knew how to command attention through sheer professional presence. He reached the stage. He looked at Marcus. "Special Agent Whitmore, FBI Art Crime Team, retired. I'm here in a consulting capacity for federal prosecutors. We need to halt this auction immediately." Marcus looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at me. The Dubai collector stood up and walked toward the exit. Within 30 seconds half the room was moving, people sensing catastrophe and removing themselves from its proximity. There must be some mistake, Marcus said, but his voice carried no conviction. He already knew. He was already calculating his own liability, his own exposure. No mistake, James said. He opened one of the equipment cases. Inside was a portable X-ray fluorescence analyzer, the same kind we'd used in the field to test material composition without damaging samples. Mr. Henderson, I'm going to ask you to select 3 lots at random from what's already been sold today. We're going to authenticate them right here, right now, in front of everyone who's still in this room. Marcus looked at Victoria again. She said nothing. Her face had gone completely blank, protective shutdown, the expression of someone whose brain is scrambling to find an exit that doesn't exist. Lot 1, Marcus said quietly. The Qing vase. Lot 4, the Fabergé egg. Lot 7, the Renaissance chalice. James nodded to his technicians. They retrieved the pieces from their display positions. Set them on the stage under the lights. Positioned the XRF analyzer. The machine hummed to life. James ran the sensor over the Qing vase for 30 seconds, analyzing its material composition. Then he looked at the readout screen. Modern ceramic compound, he said, his voice carrying through the silent ballroom. Contains trace elements consistent with 21st century Chinese manufacturing. Specifically, the glaze contains titanium dioxide that wasn't used in ceramics until 1950. This piece was created sometime after 2005, possibly as late as 2010. He moved to the Fabergé egg. Another scan. Another readout. Modern gold plating over base metal. The enamel work contains synthetic compounds developed in the 1990s. This was made within the last 20 years. The Renaissance chalice was last. The skin took longer because silver was harder to date precisely. But when James looked up, his expression was definitive. Contemporary silver alloy. Contains trace amounts of rhodium used in modern silversmithing. This piece is less than 15 years old. He turned to face the audience. What remained of it? Maybe 80 people now, the ones too shocked or too curious to leave. Every piece in this auction is a modern reproduction. Expert-level forgery, but forgery nonetheless. The estimated values in the catalog are inflated by approximately 2,000%. Buyers who have already paid for lots 1 through 8 have been defrauded. Victoria grabbed the microphone from Marcus's hand. Her voice came through the speaker's loud and desperate. I didn't know. I had no idea. My father, he provided the provenance documents. I trusted him. This is his collection. If they're fake, he's the one who bought them, who claimed they were authentic. You're correct, I said, and I stepped onto the stage. I took the microphone from her hand. She was trembling now, shaking like she was cold, and I looked at her and felt nothing but the satisfaction of a completed operation. I bought every piece. I commissioned them from expert forgers. I created the false provenance. I built this collection specifically to test whether you were actually my daughter or just someone waiting for me to die so you could liquidate my assets. I turned to the audience. To the cameras that were still recording. To the journalists who were typing frantically on their phones. My daughter obtained power of attorney through medical fraud. She used forged documents claiming I was cognitively impaired. She consigned these pieces for auction knowing I would be in Florida, unable to object or interfere. She spent $200,000 of Sotheby's money marketing and producing catalogs for this sale. She committed wire fraud by soliciting international buyers for goods she falsely represented as authentic. She did all of this deliberately, knowingly, with full intent to defraud both me and every buyer in this room. Victoria tried to run. She made it 3 steps before one of the FBI agents moved to intercept. Ms. Vance, he said, professional and impersonal. We need you to come with us for questioning. Dad, Victoria said, looking back at me, her eyes wide and desperate. Dad, please. I'm your daughter. You can't do this to me. You stopped being my daughter when you forged medical records to declare me incompetent, I said. Now you're just another criminal I helped catch. They led her out of the ballroom through a side exit. The remaining audience sat in stunned silence. Marcus was on his phone with Sotheby's legal department, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. James was directing his technicians to secure the remaining lots as evidence. I stood on the stage under the spotlight and felt the weight of 16 years of planning settle into something final and irreversible. The trap was closed. The mechanism had executed perfectly. Victoria had walked herself into federal custody believing she was walking into wealth and vindication. And I had stood back and watched her do it, providing just enough rope for her to construct her own gallows. They didn't take Victoria to jail immediately. The FBI doesn't work that way with white-collar fraud. They took her to a conference room in the hotel, one of those corporate spaces with beige walls and bad lighting and a table that seated 12. I watched them lead her down the hall, her heels clicking on marble that cost more per square foot than most people made in a week, and then I followed. James walked beside me, carrying a leather briefcase that contained 16 years of documentation. "You don't have to be here for this," he said. "She's going to lawyer up immediately. She won't say anything useful." "I'm not here for information," I said. "I'm here to watch her understand what she did." The conference room had windows overlooking Copley Square. Spring afternoon light came through the glass, warm and golden, making everything look softer than it was. Victoria sat at the head of the table, her hands folded in front of her, her posture rigid. She'd stopped shaking, but her face had that pale bloodless quality people get when shock starts wearing off and reality begins its work. The two FBI agents sat across from her. Special Agent Catherine Morrison, mid-40s, 20 years in financial crimes, and Special Agent David Chen, younger, maybe 35, with the sharp, precise energy of someone who still believed the system worked. I knew Morrison from my federal years. We'd worked the Hoffman case together in 2007. She looked at me when I entered and nodded once, acknowledgement without warmth. James and I took seats at the far end of the table. Observers, not interrogators. Richard Hartman arrived 10 minutes later, my attorney, carrying 2 banker's boxes full of documents. He set them on the table with a heavy thud that made Victoria flinch. "Ms. Vance," Morrison said, her voice professionally neutral. "You're not under arrest at this time. You're here for questioning regarding potential fraud and elder abuse. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand these rights?" "I want my attorney," Victoria said. Her voice was thin, stretched tight. "Clive Ashford. He's at Ashford and Baines on State Street." Chen pulled out his phone and made the call. We waited. Nobody spoke. Victoria stared at her hands. I watched her and felt that same cold clarity, that sense of watching a mechanism complete its final operations. Outside the windows, tourists walked through Copley Square taking photographs of Trinity Church. A street musician was playing saxophone, the music faint through the glass. Life continued normally for people who hadn't just destroyed themselves. Clive Ashford arrived 40 minutes later. He was 60-something, gray hair expensively cut, wearing a suit that probably cost $8,000. He had the smooth, confident manner of someone who'd spent 40 years defending wealthy people from the consequences of their choices. He sat down next to Victoria and put his briefcase on the table. "My client will not be answering questions at this time," he said immediately. "If you have charges to file, file them. Otherwise, we're leaving." Morrison smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "Mr. Ashford, your client authorized an auction of forged goods worth approximately $50,000 while representing them as authentic pieces worth $10 million. She solicited international buyers, which makes it wire fraud. She obtained power of attorney through medical documentation that we verified as fraudulent, which is elder abuse and identity theft. She spent $200,000 of Sotheby's advance money on marketing and catalogs for goods she should have known were fake, which is commercial fraud. We have documentation, recordings, and witness testimony for all of it. The question isn't whether we're filing charges. The question is whether your client wants to cooperate now or wait until the U.S. attorney adds conspiracy charges when we identify everyone else who helped her. My client was deceived by her father, Ashford said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. He was starting to see the shape of the problem. She believed the collection was authentic based on provenance documents he provided. That would be a viable defense, James said, speaking for the first time, if we didn't have recordings of her acknowledging that the medical documents were fabricated. Victoria's head snapped up. What recordings? I pulled out my phone. I placed it on the table and pressed play. Victoria's voice filled the conference room, tinny through the phone speaker but perfectly clear. This was from April 8th, the conversation in my shop's back office that I'd recorded through the heating vent. Did you file the updated medical reports with the probate court? That was Ashford's voice. Yes, Victoria answered. Judge Morrison accepted them without question. The cognitive decline diagnosis from Dr. Chen was particularly effective. She didn't even ask for verification. Good, Ashford said. That solidifies your authority under the power of attorney. If your father tries to contest the auction, we have documented medical evidence of his incompetence. He won't contest it, Victoria said. He doesn't even understand what's happening. Half the time he can't remember what day it is. By the time he figures out the collection is gone, he'll be in Florida and there's nothing he can do about it. I stopped the recording. Victoria had gone gray. Ashford was staring at his client with the expression of a lawyer realizing he'd just inherited a catastrophe. Dr. Chen hasn't practiced in Massachusetts since 2023, Morrison said. He retired and moved to Arizona. The medical reports filed with probate court were created by someone using his stolen identity and forged credentials. That's medical fraud, identity theft, and perjury in court filings. She looked at Ashford. Which means you're implicated, Mr. Ashford. You prepared and filed fraudulent documents with a Massachusetts court. I relied on my client's representation that the documents were authentic, Ashford said quickly. I had no knowledge of any fraud. Your voice is on the recording, James said. Acknowledging that the diagnosis was effective for solidifying authority. That's consciousness of guilt. You knew the medical evidence was questionable and you filed it anyway. Ashford stood up. I'm withdrawing as counsel. Ms. Vance, I strongly advise you to retain new representation immediately. He picked up his briefcase and walked out. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Victoria sat alone at the table, abandoned by her attorney, and I watched her face as the reality settled in. She'd lost her lawyer. She'd lost her defense. She was alone in a room with federal agents and 16 years of evidence. I didn't know, she said, her voice breaking. I didn't know they were fake. He's my father. I trusted him. I thought I was helping manage his estate properly. You thought you were liquidating his assets to fund your divorce settlement, I said. She turned to look at me, tears starting to track down her face. You set me up. You created fake pieces. You planted them in your shop. You forged provenance documents. You built this whole thing to trap me. I built it to test you, I corrected. There's a difference. I wanted to know if you were actually concerned about my welfare or just interested in my assets. You failed the test. I'm your daughter, Victoria said, her voice rising toward hysteria. I made mistakes but I'm your daughter. You can't destroy me like this. You stopped being my daughter when you forged medical records, I said. When you declared me incompetent to a probate court judge. When you planned to auction my life's work while I was locked in a memory care facility in Florida unable to contest it. You made those choices. I just documented them. Richard Hartman opened the first banker's box. He began removing documents and spreading them across the conference table. Let me show you what you actually bought, he said. First document, receipt from Prague, dated June 2008. Mikhail Volkov, glasswork artisan, $400 for one Tiffany-style lamp reproduction. Attached chemical analysis showing modern materials. Second document, invoice from St. Petersburg, dated March 2009. Dmitry Kuzmin, decorative egg maker, $3,200 for one imperial-style egg. Attached X-ray fluorescence report showing contemporary gold plating. Third document, customs declaration from Hong Kong, dated August 2013. One jade Buddha statue, declared value $300, purchased from Heritage Gift Emporium on Nathan Road. He kept going. 47 pieces, 47 receipts, 47 authentication reports proving modern origin. The table filled with paper, a documentary record of every forgery I'd commissioned. This is the collection you auctioned, Richard said. Total acquisition cost, approximately $53,000 over 7 years. Represented auction value, $10 million. That's a fraud multiplier of roughly 188 to 1. Federal sentencing guidelines treat anything over 5 to 1 as aggravated fraud. You're looking at the maximum range. Victoria was sobbing now, her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. I needed the money. Mark took everything in the divorce. The gallery is failing. I'm going to lose my business, my apartment, everything I built. I just needed enough to start over. So you decided to steal from your father, Morrison said. You decided that your financial problems justified elder abuse and fraud. He abandoned us, Victoria shouted, looking up, her face blotchy and wet. When Mom was dying, he spent all his time with his precious collection. He cared more about his antiques than his own family. He disappeared into that shop and left us alone. So yes, I thought if he valued those things more than people, maybe those things should pay for the damage he caused. The room went silent. Even the FBI agents looked uncomfortable. This was the real confession, the emotional truth under the legal fraud. She'd convinced herself that stealing from me was justice, that my perceived neglect entitled her to my assets. Your mother was dying of cancer, I said quietly. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave her 6 months. I spent every evening with her in hospice. Every single evening for 5 months until she passed. You visited twice. Twice in 5 months, Victoria. You were too busy with your gallery opening to sit with your dying mother. So don't tell me I abandoned anyone. Don't rewrite history to justify theft. You could have given me the money, she said, her voice breaking. If you just helped me when I asked, none of this would have happened. You never asked, I said. You schemed. You manipulated. You forged documents and filed false medical reports and planned an auction while I was supposed to be locked away in Florida. You never once came to me honestly and said you needed help. You decided I was an asset to be liquidated, and you moved forward with that plan systematically and deliberately. I stood up. I'd seen enough. I'd heard enough. Agent Morrison, I'm filing formal charges. Elder abuse, fraud, identity theft, perjury, and wire fraud. I want full prosecution. Morrison nodded. We'll forward everything to the U.S. Attorney. Given the dollar amounts and the international component, I'd expect charges within 30 days. I looked at Victoria one last time. She was destroyed, physically and emotionally demolished, crying at a conference table in a luxury hotel while her life disintegrated around her. The Real collection is in Geneva, I said. $42 million in authenticated pieces that you never touched and never will. I moved them in 2009. The year after your mother died, because I saw what you were becoming. I saw you calculate her life insurance payout before she was even gone. I saw you inventory the house while we were still planning the funeral. I knew this day was coming. I just had to wait for you to confirm what I already knew. What's that? Victoria asked, her voice barely a whisper. That you never loved me, I said. You loved what I owned. And the moment you thought you could take it without permission, you did. You're not my daughter. You're just a thief who shares my DNA. I walked out of the conference room. Richard and James followed, leaving Victoria alone with the FBI agents and the wreckage of her choices. We took the elevator down to the lobby. Nobody spoke. Outside, Copley Square was still full of tourists and spring afternoon light. The saxophone player was still performing, something jazzy and complicated that echoed off the surrounding buildings. James put his hand on my shoulder. That was brutal, Sterling. That was necessary, I corrected. She needed to understand what she did. Not just legally, but morally. She needed to hear it from me, in my voice, with no ambiguity. Do you feel better? James asked. I thought about that question. Did I feel better? Did destroying my daughter's life bring satisfaction? I feel finished, I said finally. I built something to test a hypothesis. The test confirmed my hypothesis. Now the work is done. Richard handed me a folder. The civil suits will start within a week. Sotheby's will sue her for the advance costs. The buyers who paid for the first 8 lots will sue for fraud and damages. The Florida facility will sue for the deposit she placed using anticipated auction proceeds. She's going to be buried in litigation for years, even if she avoids prison. Good, I said. Let her spend the next decade learning what it feels like when someone takes everything you have. We walked across Copley Square toward the street. Behind us, in a conference room on the second floor of the Fairmont, my daughter was being read her rights and processed into the federal criminal justice system. I didn't look back. I'd spent 16 years preparing for this moment, and now that it had arrived, I felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of completed work. The trap had functioned exactly as designed. Victoria had walked into it with full confidence, believing she was exploiting a confused old man's assets. Instead, she'd walked into a federal case constructed by someone who'd spent 30 years building cases against people who thought they were smarter than the system. She'd forgotten that I was the system. I'd taught federal agents how to identify fraud. I'd written training protocols for authentication procedures. I'd testified in courts about provenance verification. And I'd used every skill I'd ever learned to document my own daughter's betrayal with the thoroughness of a federal investigation. We reached the street. James had parked in a garage 2 blocks away. Richard needed to return to his office to begin processing the civil filings. I stood on the sidewalk and felt the spring sun on my face, warm and bright and utterly indifferent to human catastrophe. What now? James asked. Now I go to Geneva, I said. I'm going to sit in a vault with $42 million in authentic art and remember what real value looks like. I'm writing this from Geneva, sitting in the viewing room at Geneva Storage Solutions AG, where my real collection has rested for 17 years behind 6 inches of reinforced steel and a security system that costs more annually than most people earn. The Ming vases glow under museum-quality lighting, their glaze work catching the light in ways the Prague reproductions never could. The authentic Fabergé eggs sit in climate-controlled cases, each one a masterpiece of Imperial Russian craftsmanship, purchased by my grandfather in 1937 when the Soviet government was liquidating the Romanov collections to fund industrialization. The Renaissance silverware gleams on black velvet, 5 centuries old, bearing the maker's marks of Florentine masters whose names appear in art history textbooks. This is what real value looks like. Not the price someone might pay, but the accumulated weight of history, craftsmanship, and provenance. Victoria never understood that distinction. To her, value was always a number on an auction catalog, a figure she could convert into divorce settlements and failing gallery operations. She looked at beauty and saw only its liquidity. The legal aftermath unfolded exactly as Richard predicted. Sotheby's filed suit on May 20th, seeking recovery of $200,000 in advance costs plus damages for reputational harm. Victoria had no defense. The contract she'd signed made her personally liable for any misrepresentation of consigned goods. The buyers who'd paid for the first 8 lots filed a class action on May 27. They were represented by a firm that specialized in art fraud, people who understood exactly how to calculate damages when someone sells you a $300 Hong Kong gift shop Buddha while claiming it's a $200,000 antiquity. The multiplication of fraud, the breach of trust, the international wire components that triggered federal sentencing enhancements. The civil suit sought $17 million in compensatory and punitive damages. The Florida Memory Care Facility sued on June 2 for the $15,000 deposit Victoria had placed using money from a pre-auction private sale. She'd sold Lot 32, a supposedly rare medieval manuscript, to a private collector for $80,000 before the auction even began. The manuscript was actually a reproduction I'd commissioned from a calligrapher in Dublin in 2012 for $1,200. The private collector was, unsurprisingly, also suing. The federal charges came through on June 9. United States Attorney's Office, District of Massachusetts. 18 counts including wire fraud, mail fraud, elder abuse, identity theft, and making false statements to federal investigators. The last charge came from her initial FBI interview, where she'd claimed she had no knowledge the pieces were reproductions. Then they played her the recordings where she discussed fabricating medical documents and acknowledged that I was competent when she activated the power of attorney. Lying to federal agents is its own separate crime, and Victoria had walked into it because she still believed she could control the narrative. Her new attorney, a public defender named Sarah Kim who looked 12 years old but had 15 years of federal trial experience, negotiated a plea agreement in August. Victoria pled guilty to 7 counts in exchange for dismissal of the remaining 11. Sentencing guidelines called for 8 to 10 years. Judge Patricia Emmons, who'd been on the federal bench since 1998 and had a reputation for harsh treatment of elder abuse cases, gave her 12 years with possibility of parole after 8. Victoria collapsed when the sentence was read. They had to help her out of the courtroom. I wasn't there. I was in Geneva, sitting in this same chair, looking at the same collection I'm looking at now. Richard sent me the transcript. The civil suit settled over the following 6 months. Victoria declared bankruptcy in September. She had no assets except the failing gallery, which sold at auction for $60,000, barely enough to cover its outstanding debts. Sotheby's received 40 cents on the dollar. The buyer class action received nothing because there was nothing to receive. You can't extract blood from a stone, and Victoria was a stone by that point, hollowed out and worthless. Her husband Mark, who'd filed for divorce in January, completed the process in October. He took the apartment, the car, and the joint savings account. Victoria kept her name and approximately $240,000 in debt she'd never be able to pay. Clive Ashford, her attorney who'd helped fabricate the medical documents, was disbarred in November after a 3-month ethics investigation. He tried to claim he'd relied on his client's representations, but the recordings proved he'd participated knowingly in the fraud. Last I heard he was working as a legal consultant in New Hampshire, helping small businesses with contract review, making about 1/10 of what he'd earned as a partner in a Boston firm. The shop on Boylston Street is still mine. I reopened it in July after spending 2 months in Geneva, just sitting with the real collection, remembering what my father looked like when he showed me my first authenticated Ming vase, remembering my grandfather's stories about buying imperial eggs from desperate Soviet bureaucrats in Paris. I restocked the shop with actual antiques, pieces I purchased from estate sales and legitimate dealers, nothing spectacular but all authentic. I hung a new sign in the window. Sterling Vance Authentication Services. Former FBI Art Crime Team. 30 years experience identifying forgeries. Free initial consultation. Business has been extraordinary. Collectors come from across New England bringing pieces they need verified. Insurance companies hire me to authenticate high-value claims. Museums consult me on potential acquisitions. I charge $200 an hour, and I'm booked 3 months out. Turns out there's significant demand for someone who famously caught his own daughter committing auction fraud. The case made national news. CNN ran a feature about elder abuse and art fraud. The Wall Street Journal published an investigation into Sotheby's authentication failures. Forbes did a profile on me, focusing on how I'd used my FBI training to document a family betrayal. The headline was, "The Art of Revenge, How One Man Built a 16-Year Trap for His Daughter." I didn't cooperate with any of the press coverage. I let the court records speak for themselves. People ask if I feel guilty. If I regret the trap. If I wish I'd simply told Victoria no when she first started showing interest in the collection. They ask if I lie awake at night thinking about my daughter in federal prison, wearing institutional clothing, eating commissary food, living in an 8x10 cell. The answer is no. I sleep fine. I sleep better than I have in 15 years, actually, because the uncertainty is gone. I don't wonder anymore if Victoria loves me or just my assets. I don't question whether I'm a father or just a source of potential inheritance. I know exactly what she is, because she showed me with her actions when she thought I was too incompetent to stop her. She forged medical documents. She filed false reports with a court. She spent $200,000 marketing my fabricated collection. She planned to lock me in a memory care facility while she liquidated what she thought was my life's work. Those aren't the actions of a daughter. Those are the actions of a thief who happens to share my genetic material. The real question isn't why I trapped her. The question is why anyone thinks I shouldn't have. Why should competence protect incompetence? Why should a man who built something real watch it stolen by someone who only understood its price? Why should silence be mistaken for consent, or patience mistaken for weakness? I built a test. Victoria failed it. The consequences she's experiencing are the natural result of her choices, not my vengeance. I didn't send her to prison. She sent herself there by committing fraud. I just documented it with the thoroughness of someone who spent 30 years teaching federal agents how to document fraud. Last week I received a letter from her. It came through Richard's office, forwarded from the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut, where Victoria is serving her sentence. I opened it standing in my shop, afternoon light coming through the windows, dust motes drifting in the golden air. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten on institutional paper, and it said all the things you'd expect. Apologies. Explanations. Pleas for forgiveness. She talked about therapy in prison, about understanding now what drove her actions, about recognizing the damage she'd caused. She said she'd spent 8 months thinking about her choices and she finally understood that she'd betrayed not just me but herself, that she'd become someone her mother would have been ashamed of. She asked if I could ever forgive her. She asked if there was any possibility of rebuilding our relationship after her release. She asked if I could see her, just once, so she could apologize in person. I read the letter twice. Then I put it in my desk drawer with the other documents I keep for archival purposes. I didn't respond. Forgiveness isn't something she gets to request. It's not a transaction where sufficient apology yields absolution. She destroyed our relationship deliberately, systematically, with full knowledge of what she was doing. The woman who wrote that letter asking for forgiveness is the same woman who forged medical documents and filed false court reports. She's not sorry she did it. She's sorry she got caught. There's a difference. I'm 71 now. My knee still clicks when I walk. My back still aches in the mornings. I still use the same oak counter in my shop, my forearms still resting in the depressions I've worn into the wood over 3 decades. But the weight I carried for 16 years, the uncertainty about Victoria's intentions, the question of whether I was a father or just an asset, that weight is gone. I know what she is. I know what I am. The world is clear. Sometimes in the evening I sit in my apartment above the shop and watch the street below. People walking to dinner. Couples holding hands. Families with children pointing at shop windows. Normal life, proceeding without drama or betrayal or federal investigations. That normalcy is what I bought with 16 years of planning. Not revenge. Not satisfaction. Just clarity. Just the ability to live without wondering if the person who calls you dad is actually calculating how long until your death releases your assets. I pour coffee from the old percolator. I sit in my chair by the window. I watch the light fade from amber to blue to black. The taste of the coffee is bitter and familiar. The weight of the mug in my hands is solid and real. Outside, the city continues its evening routine, indifferent to individual catastrophes, indifferent to family betrayals and federal sentences and daughters who destroyed themselves through greed. And I sit in the quiet satisfaction of completed work, knowing that I built something to test a hypothesis, the test confirmed my hypothesis, and now the work is done. Victoria thought my silence was weakness. She thought my patience was incompetence. She thought an old man playing with dusty trinkets was someone she could exploit without consequence. She was wrong. And the cost of being wrong was 12 years in federal prison and the permanent destruction of her professional reputation and the knowledge that her father built a trap specifically for her and she walked into it with absolute confidence. That's not revenge. That's education. Sometimes the most valuable lesson is the one that costs you everything to learn. Victoria learned that lesson. I just made sure she learned it thoroughly, completely, with no ambiguity about who taught it or why. The coffee is cold now. The street below is dark except for streetlights and the occasional car. I should go to bed. Tomorrow I have 3 authentication consultations scheduled and a new estate acquisition to examine. Life continues. Work continues. The world turns. Victoria sits in a cell in Connecticut. I sit in my apartment in Boston. Between us is 16 years of planning and 1 moment of perfect execution when a daughter tried to destroy her father and discovered he'd already prepared for exactly that eventuality. I built my life to resist exactly the kind of exploitation she attempted. She mistook the surface for the substance. She saw dusty trinkets and assumed incompetence. She saw silence and assumed consent. She saw an old man and assumed weakness. Every assumption was wrong. And now she has 12 years to contemplate the difference between appearance and authenticity, between what things seem to be and what they actually are. I taught her that lesson the way I learned it myself, through the FBI, through 30 years of hunting forgers who thought they could fool the system. You authenticate through patient examination. You verify through documentation. You trust nothing at face value. And when someone shows you who they are through their actions, you believe them. Victoria showed me who she was. I believed her. The rest was just documentation.